The night was alive with the glitter of chandeliers, the hum of classical music, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Blackthorn City's elite gathered for an extravagant gala, the annual fundraiser hosted by the powerful Fernandez family. Carl Fernandez, the notorious heir to a vast criminal empire, stood at the edge of the ballroom. His black suit, perfectly tailored, exuded both wealth and danger. With his sharp jawline and cold, calculating eyes, Carl commanded the room's attention without saying a word. But beneath the sophistication, Carl was bored. He had been to too many of these events, where people whispered behind his back about his family's criminal dealings, but smiled to his face. His life was a carefully constructed machine. Everything in its place, everyone falling in line. Until tonight. At first, he noticed her as a blur of movement on the other side of the ballroom. A woman spinning around with reckless abandon, her red dress swirling as she twirled in circles. She wasn't part of this world. She wasn't following the decorum. Lovely Summers had crashed the gala on a dare, armed with nothing but a fake invitation, a dress she found at a thrift store, and her signature wild smile. She had no idea who Carl was, nor did she care. Lovely danced as if the world was her playground. She stole champagne glasses from trays and flung herself into the center of conversations she wasn't invited to. Carl watched, intrigued. No one had ever caused such a scene at one of his family's events. As people began to murmur, his bodyguards approached her, but Lovely was too quick, dodging them with a grin that challenged the entire room. She laughed in their faces, skipping away like a child playing tag. When Carl saw Lovely dart for the exit, her carefree laugh echoing across the ballroom, he followed. The chase was on. He found her in the grand staircase, catching her wrist just as she was about to flee. Their eyes met, his cold and calculating, hers bright and mischievous. Going somewhere? Carl's voice was low, dangerous. Lovely only smiled, a sparkle of defiance in her eyes. You don't seem like the dancing type. For a moment, Carl was stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that. But before he could respond, Lovely yanked her hand free, disappearing into the night. He watched her vanish with a smirk on his face, realizing he had just met someone who played by no one's rules but her own. Days passed, but Carl couldn't get Lovely out of his mind. He had dealt with dangerous people before, rival gang leaders, traitors, and mercenaries. But this girl, this reckless, carefree troublemaker had left him feeling something he hadn't in a long time: curiosity. Lovely wasn't like anyone Carl had ever known. She lived in a world far removed from his. While Carl's life was ruled by control and power, Lovely seemed to float through hers without a care, leaving chaos in her wake. He found himself needing to know more about her. Why was she like this? Who was she? Carl had his men investigate her, and within a few days, he had a complete dossier on Lovely Summers. Orphaned at a young age, she had bounced between foster homes before striking out on her own. No stable job, no family ties, and a list of minor offenses: trespassing, disorderly conduct, petty theft. But it wasn't criminal behavior born of necessity. No, it seemed Lovely caused trouble just for the thrill of it. She was an enigma, a woman who thrived on chaos, who laughed in the face of danger. The more Carl read about her, the more intrigued he became. Meanwhile, Lovely had forgotten all about the fancy gala and the brooding man she had encountered. She lived in the moment, never looking back. Today, she was working a part-time job as a barista at a small cafe downtown, where she barely managed to keep up with orders and constantly mixed up the names on cups. It was just another stop in her unpredictable life. But then Carl walked into her cafe. He didn't come in with bodyguards or make a scene. He simply walked up to the counter, his dark eyes watching her every move. Lovely didn't recognize him at first. To her, he was just another customer, albeit one with an unsettlingly intense gaze. She gave him a bright smile and took his order, scribbling Clark on his cup instead of Carl. He didn't correct her. Every day after that, Carl returned to the cafe. He didn't say much, didn't reveal who he really was, but Lovely noticed him. He always sat in the same spot, observing her with those piercing eyes, as if he was trying to unravel her mystery. She found it amusing, maybe a little bit creepy, but mostly amusing. So, she decided to have some fun. Lovely had always been good at reading people, and something about Carl screamed control freak. He was always so composed, so careful with every movement, every word. Naturally, she couldn't resist the temptation to mess with him. It started with small things. She would accidentally spill his coffee or give him the wrong order. When he asked for his drink to go, she'd give him a mug instead. Carl never reacted the way she expected. Most people would snap or get annoyed, but Carl only watched her with that same calm intensity. It was as if he found her antics interesting. The more she tried to throw him off balance, the more Carl became fascinated with her. Lovely was a whirlwind of chaos, and Carl, for all his power and control, was being pulled in. He didn't like how unpredictable she was, but he couldn't help but admire her defiance. She was the first person in a long time who wasn't afraid of him, who didn't even know to be afraid. One afternoon, Carl's patience was put to the test when Lovely orchestrated an elaborate prank. She rearranged the entire cafe, swapping chairs with tables, hiding utensils in ridiculous places, and even convincing her coworkers to join in. When Carl walked in, he was greeted with the sight of utter mayhem. Customers confused, staff laughing, and Lovely sitting on top of a counter, looking smug. Carl didn't show it, but he was furious. Lovely had clearly gone too far this time. Yet, instead of chastising her, Carl walked up to the counter, calmly ordered his usual coffee, and sat down in his regular seat as if nothing was wrong. Lovely watched, surprised and maybe a little disappointed that he wasn't reacting. She jumped down from the counter and approached him, leaning close with a playful grin. "You're really not going to say anything?" Carl looked up at her, his gaze steady. "What's the point? You live for the reaction. Why give you what you want?" Lovely was taken aback. No one had ever called her out so plainly before. She liked causing trouble because it was fun, but Carl, he was playing a different game, one that she didn't quite understand yet. Lovely's mischief had always been a way to push people away, to keep them at a distance. But Carl was different. He wasn't backing down, and that intrigued her. For the first time in a long time, someone was actually sticking around long enough to challenge her. Carl, on the other hand, found himself more entangled with Lovely than he had intended. Every time he walked into the cafe, he told himself it would be the last time. But every day, he found himself coming back. There was something about Lovely's wild energy that drew him in, something he couldn't control. Then came the night when things escalated beyond their usual games. Lovely had a habit of finding trouble wherever she went, and that night was no exception. After her shift at the cafe, she wandered into a bar known for its rough clientele. She had no reason to be there other than curiosity and boredom. Within minutes, she had antagonized a group of men playing pool, and it wasn't long before things got heated. Carl, who had been keeping an eye on Lovely ever since their first encounter, arrived just in time to see the commotion. He watched from the shadows as Lovely, outnumbered and out of her depth, stood her ground against the men. They didn't scare her, but Carl knew she was in real danger. As one of the men lunged toward her, Carl stepped in. The bar fell silent as Carl grabbed the man's wrist mid-swing, his cold gaze freezing the room. He didn't need to say anything. His mere presence was enough to send the men retreating. Lovely, of course, was less than impressed. "I had it under control," she said, crossing her arms. Carl smirked, his dark eyes locking with hers. "Sure you did." But even as she glared at him, there was something else in her eyes, something she couldn't quite place. For the first time, Carl had stepped into her chaotic world, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. Carl had no intention of letting Lovely's reckless nature spiral out of control. After the bar incident, he made it clear that she was under his protection, whether she liked it or not. But convincing her to listen was a different challenge altogether. Lovely was fiercely independent, allergic to the idea of anyone, especially a powerful, controlling figure like Carl, telling her what to do. The night after the bar, Carl made his way to Lovely's apartment. It was in a shabby part of Blackthorn, a far cry from the luxurious penthouse Carl called home. Lovely's apartment was as chaotic as she was, books and clothes scattered everywhere, a guitar leaning against the wall, and a half-eaten pizza box on the coffee table. Lovely sat cross-legged on the couch, watching TV with the volume blaring. Carl didn't bother knocking. He had men outside her building, keeping an eye on things, and he was tired of her antics. Lovely barely glanced up when he walked in. "You can't just walk into people's homes, you know," she said, not even bothering to turn down the volume. "I can when they have a death wish," Carl replied coolly, crossing his arms as he stood in the middle of the room. Lovely sighed dramatically and muted the TV, turning to face him. "You're still on that? I told you. I don't need your protection." Carl's eyes narrowed. He had dealt with hardened criminals, cold-blooded killers, and ruthless rivals. Yet this girl, this infuriating, carefree girl, was his biggest challenge. "You don't realize what you've gotten yourself into," he said, his voice low. "You're not playing with ordinary people. These men don't forgive and forget." Lovely shrugged, her lips curving into a playful smile. "I've been taking care of myself just fine." "Not anymore," Carl said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're under my protection now, whether you like it or not." For the first time, Lovely saw a flicker of something deeper in Carl's eyes. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was concern, real concern. That surprised her. Why did he care so much? Carl, the villain of Blackthorn, the man with an iron grip on the city's underworld, was genuinely worried about her. It was something Lovely hadn't expected. But Lovely wasn't one to back down. She leaned forward, eyes sparkling with mischief. "And what do I get out of this little arrangement, huh?" Carl's jaw tightened. "You stay alive." Lovely laughed. It was loud and free, the kind of laugh that filled the room. "I was hoping for something more fun." Carl stared at her, completely thrown off by her attitude. In his world, people feared him, obeyed him, but Lovely didn't, and that made her more dangerous than anyone he'd ever faced. She lived outside the rules, and that meant she was unpredictable. "Then I guess you'll just have to find a way to make it fun," Carl said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous tone. It was the first time he let his mask slip, showing her a glimpse of the real man behind the cold exterior. Lovely raised an eyebrow, her smile growing wider. "Is that a challenge?" Carl's eyes locked with hers. "Consider it a partnership." From that moment on, they were an unlikely pair. Carl, the villain with a plan for everything, and Lovely, the chaos he couldn't control. Their partnership was full of tension, but there was also an undeniable pull between them, something neither of them could ignore. As much as Lovely loved to test Carl's patience, she found herself drawn to his intensity. And Carl, who had always lived in a world of control and strategy, found himself captivated by Lovely's unpredictable nature. The partnership was rocky from the start. Carl had men watching Lovely, but keeping her out of trouble was like trying to stop a wildfire with a bucket of water. She slipped away from her guards constantly, sometimes out of sheer boredom, sometimes just to see what would happen. One night, Lovely decided to push Carl's buttons in the most spectacular way possible. There was a high-stakes underground poker game happening, run by one of Carl's criminal rivals. Lovely, of course, crashed the event, charming her way past security and pretending to be a player. She didn't have the slightest clue how to play poker, but that didn't stop her from sitting at the table and bluffing her way through the first few rounds. Carl found out about Lovely's little stunt halfway through the night. When he arrived at the poker den, she was holding a stack of chips and laughing like she had just won the lottery. Carl's blood boiled. This wasn't just a game. Lovely had walked right into a lion's den. The men in that room were dangerous, ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill her if they figured out she wasn't supposed to be there. Carl barged into the room, his presence immediately silencing the table. The other players backed off, recognizing who he was, but Lovely just grinned up at him from her seat. "Care to join?" she asked sweetly, pushing a pile of chips toward him. Carl didn't respond. His face was a mask of cold fury, but Lovely wasn't intimidated. She never was. Instead, She stood up, gathering her winnings, mostly stolen chips, and sauntered over to him. "I was just having a little fun," she whispered as she passed him. "You should try it sometime." Carl grabbed her arm, pulling her close, his voice dangerously low. "You have no idea what kind of trouble you're in." Lovely looked up at him, her smile fading slightly. For the first time, she saw the raw anger in his eyes, and it made her heart race. Not out of fear, but something else. She pulled away, her playful demeanor slipping just for a moment. "I thought we were partners," she said quietly. Carl's grip tightened for a second before he let her go. Partners don't get each other killed. The tension between them was electric, a mix of anger, frustration, and something neither of them was ready to acknowledge yet. Lovely had gone too far, and for the first time, she realized that maybe Carl wasn't just being overprotective. Maybe he really did care. But caring wasn't something Lovely knew how to handle. She had always lived in the moment, never thinking about the consequences. Now, for the first time, she had to face the fact that her actions had real stakes. The days after the poker game were strained. Lovely didn't try to push Carl's buttons as much, though it wasn't out of fear. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name. Carl, on the other hand, kept his distance, watching her from afar. He didn't trust himself to be too close to her. She had a way of making him lose control, something he couldn't afford in his line of work. But fate had other plans. One evening, after a long day of dodging Carl's men and causing minor chaos in the city, Lovely found herself in trouble again. This time, it wasn't something she could laugh her way out of. A group of thugs had cornered her in an alley, men hired by Carl's enemies to send him a message. Lovely had been careless, wandering into a part of town that even she knew was dangerous. Carl got the call just as he was finishing a meeting. His blood ran cold when he heard the words, "We've got her." Without thinking, Carl sped through the streets, his mind racing. When he arrived at the alley, he saw Lovely surrounded, her back pressed against the wall. She was trying to talk her way out of it, but the men weren't listening. Carl stepped in, his presence like a thunderstorm, dark and dangerous. The fight that followed was quick and brutal. Carl's men dealt with the thugs, but Carl's focus was on Lovely. She was shaken, her usual bravado gone. When the last of the attackers were dragged away, Carl turned to her, his face unreadable. "You're hurt," he said, noticing a cut on her arm. Lovely looked down at the blood, surprised to see it. She hadn't even realized she was injured. Carl took a step closer, his eyes softening just a fraction. "I told you, this isn't a game," he said, his voice quieter now. For the first time, Lovely didn't have a snarky reply. She just stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't used to people caring, really caring, and Carl, the man she had thought was all steel and ice, was looking at her with an intensity that made her want to run and stay all at once. Carl reached out, gently touching her arm where the cut was. His touch was surprisingly tender, and it sent a shiver down Lovely's spine. She swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how close they were. "I'm fine," she muttered, stepping back, her defenses going up again. Carl didn't move. "No, you're not." Lovely looked up at him, her walls cracking just a little. "Why do you care so much?" Carl's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Lovely thought he might kiss her. But instead, he stepped back, his expression hardening again. "Because you're my responsibility." Lovely wanted to argue, to push him away like she always did, but something in his voice stopped her. For once, she didn't have the energy to fight. The next few weeks were a blur. Carl and Lovely continued their uneasy partnership, but something had shifted between them. They spent more time together, and though they bickered constantly, there was an underlying tension that neither of them could deny. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Lovely stormed off, her emotions a mess. She didn't know why Carl got under her skin so much. He was infuriating, controlling, and way too serious. But he also made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: safe. Carl followed her, as he always did. When he caught up to her, they were in one of the quieter parts of the city, the moon casting a soft glow over the streets. "Lovely," he called, his voice firm but not angry. She stopped, not turning to face him. "What now? You gonna lecture me again?" Carl sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't good at this, at emotions. "No, I'm not here to lecture you." Lovely turned, crossing her arms over her chest. "Then what are you here for?" Carl didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know." Lovely blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. "What do you mean, you don't know?" Carl shook his head, his jaw clenching. "I mean, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. You're driving me insane, Lovely." Lovely's heart skipped a beat. "Good," she said, but her voice was softer than usual, lacking its usual bite. Carl closed the distance between them, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. Lovely froze, her breath catching in her throat. This was different. This wasn't their usual banter or power play. This was something real, something raw. "I don't want to care about you," Carl admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Lovely stared up at him, her walls crumbling. "Then don't." But they both knew it was too late for that. Carl leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of them in that moment, caught between everything they were and everything they could be. For once, there were no words, just the quiet understanding that, somehow, they were both in too deep. Lovely couldn't sleep that night. The encounter with Carl had left her shaken in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was used to chaos, to stirring the pot and seeing what came of it. But this, what was happening between them, was different. It was dangerous, but not in the way she was used to. Carl had touched her, not with the control he usually exerted, but with something softer, more genuine, and it terrified her. Lovely had lived her entire life with her defenses up, not letting anyone get too close. It was how she survived. But Carl was breaking down those walls, one look, one touch, at a time. As she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about him. His intense gaze, the way his voice had softened when he admitted he cared. It was the first time she'd seen the real Carl, the man beneath the villain. But Lovely wasn't sure she could handle it. She wasn't used to people caring about her. Not really. People came and went from her life, but no one ever stayed. She didn't know what it meant to be wanted, to be loved. She turned over in bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. She told herself she didn't care, that Carl was just another complication in her chaotic life. But the truth was, he had gotten under her skin, and that scared her more than anything. The next morning, Carl was back to his usual self, cold, distant, and in control. Lovely watched him from across the room as he went over some documents with his men, his expression unreadable. She hated how good he was at shutting her out. But Lovely wasn't one to sit quietly on the sidelines. She had never been good at playing by the rules, and she wasn't about to start now. So, when Carl finished his meeting and started to leave, she followed him. "Hey," she called, catching up to him as he walked down the hall of his office building. "We need to talk." Carl didn't slow down. "I'm busy." Lovely narrowed her eyes, quickening her pace to keep up with him. "I don't care." Carl sighed, finally stopping and turning to face her. His expression was hard, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that told Lovely he wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. "What do you want, Lovely?" he asked, his voice low. Lovely crossed her arms, her usual bravado back in full force. "I want to know why you're acting like last night didn't happen." Carl's jaw tightened. "Because it doesn't matter." "Doesn't matter?" Lovely repeated, incredulous. "You can't be serious. Carl, you practically admitted that you care about me." Carl's eyes flashed with something dark, but he quickly masked it. "That's the problem, Lovely. I can't care about you." Lovely took a step closer, her heart pounding. "Why not?" Carl didn't answer at first. He looked away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Lovely could see the conflict in him, the struggle between what he wanted and what he believed he couldn't have. "Because caring about you makes me weak," Carl finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lovely blinked, taken aback by the raw honesty in his words. She had expected him to brush her off, to give her some cold, logical reason. But this was something real, something vulnerable. Carl ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "You don't understand, Lovely. In my world, emotions are dangerous. They make you vulnerable. If my enemies find out that I care about you, they'll use me against you." Lovely finished for him, her voice softening. "I get it, Carl, but you don't have to shut me out." Carl shook his head, stepping back. "It's not that simple." Lovely watched him, her heart aching in a way she wasn't used to. She had always been the one in control, the one who didn't get attached. But now, standing in front of Carl, she realized that she had already crossed that line. Before she could say anything else, Carl's phone rang, breaking the tension between them. He answered it, his expression darkening as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "We have a problem," he muttered, hanging up and turning to his men. "Lovely, stay here." Lovely raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Carl shot her a warning look. "I mean it, Lovely. Stay out of this." But Lovely wasn't one to take orders. As Carl and his men rushed out of the building, she followed them, determined to find out what was going on. Lovely had never been good at following orders, and Carl's warning only made her more determined to see what was happening. She trailed behind Carl's men as they sped through the city, heading toward the docks, one of the more dangerous parts of town, where Carl's criminal rivals held sway. When they arrived, Lovely saw immediately that something was wrong. A group of armed men stood at the entrance to a warehouse, guarding it like their lives depended on it. Carl's men were preparing for a fight, but Carl himself was unusually quiet, his eyes scanning the area with a calculating gaze. "What's going on?" Lovely whispered as she crept up beside him. Carl didn't even flinch. "I told you to stay out of this." Lovely rolled her eyes. "Yeah, and I ignored you. What else is new?" Carl shot her a glare but didn't argue. He knew better than to try and send her away now. "It's a hostage situation," he said quietly. "One of my men was taken by a rival gang. They want to make an example of him." Lovely's heart sank. She might not have been involved in Carl's world, but she knew enough to understand that things were about to get very dangerous. She glanced at Carl, wondering how he could remain so calm in the face of something like this. But then she remembered who he was, the villain of Blackthorn, the man who had built his empire on power and control. Carl didn't show fear, because fear was a weakness. And in his world, weakness got you killed. Lovely's stomach twisted as she watched the situation unfold. She wanted to help, but she knew there was nothing she could do. This was Carl's fight, and she was just an outsider. But as the first shots were fired, Lovely's instincts kicked in. She couldn't just stand by and watch. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby piece of metal and ran toward the warehouse, ducking behind crates as bullets flew through the air. "Lovely!" Carl shouted after her, but she didn't stop. She made it to the side of the building, her heart racing as she pressed herself against the wall. From her position, she could see the men inside the warehouse, holding their hostage in the center of the room. Lovely's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. She wasn't a fighter, but she was quick, and she had a knack for getting herself out of trouble. Carl caught up to her just as she was about to make her move. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Are you insane?" he hissed. "You'll get yourself killed." Lovely shrugged, her pulse still racing. "You said we were partners, right?" Carl stared at her, his jaw clenched. "This isn't a game, Lovely." "I know that," she replied, her voice steady, "but I'm not just going to stand by and watch." For a moment, they stood there, staring at each other, the tension between them palpable. Then, without another word, Carl let go of her arm and nodded. Together, they moved toward the warehouse, working in unison to take down the guards and rescue Carl's man. Lovely wasn't a trained fighter, but she was fast and clever, using her surroundings to her advantage. Carl, on the other hand, was precise and lethal, every move calculated. When the last of the enemies were subdued, Carl's man was freed, and the situation was under control. But as they made their way out of the warehouse, Carl grabbed Lovely's hand, pulling her aside. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with anger. Lovely raised an eyebrow. "I was thinking I wasn't going to let you handle this alone." Carl's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Lovely thought he might yell at her. But instead, he pulled her closer, his hands gripping her arms tightly. "You could have died." Lovely looked up at him, her heart pounding. "So could you." Carl didn't respond. He just stared at her, his gaze intense, his emotions barely contained. And then, before Lovely could say anything else, Carl's lips were on hers, kissing her with a desperation that took her breath away. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was fierce, full of all the pent-up tension and emotions they had been fighting for so long. Lovely's hands gripped Carl's shirt as she kissed him back, her mind spinning. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. Carl's forehead rested against hers as he closed his eyes, his grip on her loosening slightly. "I can't lose you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Lovely's heart skipped a beat. "You won't." The kiss had crossed a line. Lovely knew it, and Carl knew it too. Things between them would never be the same after that moment, but neither of them could bring themselves to regret it. The following days were filled with an odd sense of calm. Carl and Lovely didn't talk about the kiss, but the air between them was charged with unspoken feelings. They continued working together, but there was a new level of understanding between them. They were no longer just partners in crime. They were something more, though neither of them could define it yet. But as their connection deepened, so did the danger surrounding them. Carl's enemies were closing in, and Lovely found herself more and more entwined in his world. She had always been good at surviving on her own, but now, with Carl by her side, she felt both stronger and more vulnerable than ever. Late one night, as they sat together in Carl's penthouse, overlooking the city lights, Lovely finally spoke up. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft. Carl didn't answer right away. He was sitting beside her on the couch, his hand resting on hers, his thumb gently tracing circles on her skin. "We keep going," he said finally, his voice low. Lovely frowned. "And what about us?" Carl's hand stilled, and for a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned to face her, his expression serious. "I don't know." Lovely swallowed, her heart aching. She knew Carl cared about her, but she also knew that his world didn't allow for love. Not the kind of love she wanted, the kind that wasn't tainted by danger and violence. "I'm not sure I can do this, Carl," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl's grip on her hand tightened. "Lovely, I'm serious," she said, cutting him off. "I don't want to live like this, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if the next fight will be our last." Carl's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he let go of her hand and stood up, walking over to the window. "I never wanted this for you," he said quietly, his back to her. Lovely watched him, her heart breaking. She had never thought she would fall for someone like Carl, but now that she had, she didn't know how to walk away. "I don't want to lose you," she said softly. Carl turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. Fear, anger, love. "You won't." But Lovely wasn't sure she believed him. The calm between Carl and Lovely didn't last. In Carl's world, peace was always fleeting. Lovely woke up one morning to find Carl gone, leaving only a hastily written note on the kitchen counter. "Had to handle something. Don't worry, I'll be back by evening. Stay inside." Lovely frowned at the note, feeling the familiar sting of frustration. Carl was always trying to protect her, but she wasn't some fragile thing that needed saving. She had survived all her life by being independent, fierce, and untamed. Yet here she was, trapped inside his penthouse like a bird in a gilded cage. But as the hours dragged on, and evening turned into night with no sign of Carl, worry began to gnaw at Lovely. She had no idea what kind of business Carl had gone off to handle, but in his world, it could be anything, from a simple meeting to a blood-soaked confrontation. Lovely paced the apartment, her anxiety building with every passing minute. She checked her phone constantly, waiting for a message or call from Carl, but there was nothing. The silence was suffocating. Just as she was about to call him herself, there was a sudden, frantic knock at the door. Lovely's heart leaped into her throat as she rushed to answer it, hoping it was Carl. But when she opened the door, it wasn't Carl standing there. It was one of his men, bruised and bleeding. "Miss Lovely," the man gasped, clutching his side. "It's Carl. He's in trouble." The words sent a wave of cold panic through her. "What do you mean he's in trouble?" she demanded, grabbing the man by the collar. "Where is he?" "The docks. He walked into a trap. They're holding him there." Lovely's blood turned to ice. The docks, the same place where they had rescued Carl's man not long ago. The place where Carl's enemies were strongest. Lovely didn't waste a second. She grabbed her jacket and rushed out the door, ignoring the man's protests. If Carl was in danger, there was no way she was staying behind. Lovely drove like a madwoman through the city, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew going to the docks alone was reckless, but she didn't care. Carl had saved her life more times than she could count, and now it was her turn to return the favor. The docks were eerily quiet when she arrived, the moon casting an eerie glow over the water. Lovely parked her car a safe distance away and crept toward the warehouse where Carl was being held. She could hear voices inside, men talking, laughing, clearly unaware that danger was closing in on them. Lovely peeked through a cracked window and saw Carl tied to a chair in the middle of the room, his face bruised and bloodied. Her heart clenched at the sight. He was hurt, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. She counted 5 men in the room, armed, but careless. They weren't expecting anyone to come for Carl. That was their first mistake. Lovely had always been underestimated, and she had always used that to her advantage. Quietly, she slipped around to the back of the building, finding a way in through an unlocked door. She moved swiftly and silently, her pulse racing as she approached the men from behind. She needed to take them out quickly, before they could react. The first man never saw her coming. Lovely picked up a heavy pipe from the floor and swung it at his head, knocking him out cold. The second turned just in time to see her, but before he could raise his gun, Lovely was on him, slamming his head into the wall. Carl, still tied to the chair, watched in disbelief as Lovely took down his captors one by one, her movements swift and precise. She was a force of nature, fierce and unrelenting. When the last man hit the ground, Carl couldn't help but smile, despite the pain in his ribs. "Lovely," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "What the hell are you doing here?" Lovely rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she untied him. "Saving your ass, obviously," she said, trying to sound nonchalant, but Carl could hear the worry in her voice. Once Carl was free, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his breath warm against her hair. Lovely clung to him, burying her face in his chest. "Don't you dare tell me that. I thought I was going to lose you." Carl pulled back just enough to look down at her, his eyes dark with emotion. "You could have been killed." Lovely looked up at him, her heart pounding. "So could you." For a moment, they just stood there, holding each other in the middle of the empty warehouse. The danger wasn't over, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. They had found each other again, and that was all that counted. The aftermath of the rescue left Lovely shaken, though she would never admit it to Carl. Back at the penthouse, Carl nursed his injuries in silence while Lovely paced the room, still buzzing with adrenaline. The sight of Carl tied up and vulnerable kept replaying in her mind. She couldn't shake the image, nor the fear that had gripped her so tightly. Carl watched her from his seat on the couch, his brow furrowed with concern. He had always seen Lovely as fearless, but now he could see the cracks in her armor. "Lovely," he said softly, breaking the silence. "You saved me tonight." Lovely stopped pacing and turned to face him, her arms crossed over her chest. "Of course I did. I'm not just going to sit around while you get yourself killed." Carl smiled, though it was a weak one. "I'm not used to having someone look out for me." Lovely's heart ached at his words. She knew Carl had spent most of his life fighting his own battles, building his empire on his own. But he didn't have to do that anymore. She was here now, and she wasn't going anywhere. "You're stuck with me now, Carl," she said, her voice soft but firm, "whether you like it or not." Carl's smile faded, replaced by a look of uncertainty. He stood up, wincing slightly as he moved toward her. "That's what I'm afraid of," he admitted quietly. Lovely frowned. "What do you mean?" Carl stopped in front of her, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek. "I'm afraid of what this means for you. My world, it's dangerous. You've already been dragged into it more than you should have. I don't want you to get hurt." Lovely placed her hand over his, her eyes searching his. "Carl, I'm not afraid of danger. I've been dealing with it my whole life." "I know," Carl said, his voice filled with emotion, "but this is different. The people I'm up against, they won't stop until they've taken everything from me. And now that you're part of my life, that includes you." Lovely's heart clenched. She knew Carl was trying to protect her, but she wasn't about to let him push her away. "I don't care," she said firmly. "We're in this together." Carl looked at her, his expression conflicted. He wanted to believe her, but he couldn't shake the fear that he was putting her in danger just by being with her. "Lovely." Before he could say anything more, Lovely kissed him. It was a fierce, desperate kiss, filled with all the emotions they had been holding back for so long. Carl kissed her back, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her closer. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. Lovely looked up at Carl, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "You're stuck with me." Carl stared down at her, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. For the first time in his life, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: hope. The peace that followed their confession didn't last long. Carl's world was never one to remain calm for long. A few days after the rescue, Carl received news that one of his closest men, someone he had trusted for years, had betrayed him. It came as a shock. Carl had always been careful about who he let into his inner circle, but somehow, someone had slipped through the cracks. The betrayal stung, not just because of the disloyalty, but because of what it meant. Carl's enemies were getting closer, and they were willing to use anyone to get to him. Lovely saw the change in Carl the moment he heard the news. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by cold, simmering anger. She had seen him angry before, but this was different. This was personal. "We need to find out who else is involved," Carl said, pacing the room as he planned his next move. "I'm not letting this slide." Lovely watched him, her stomach twisting with worry. She knew Carl could handle himself, but the idea of someone so close to him betraying him made her uneasy. If Carl couldn't trust his own men, who could he trust? As Carl made plans to root out the traitor, Lovely found herself caught in the middle. She didn't know who to trust either, but one thing was certain: whoever had betrayed Carl was a threat to both of them, and Lovely wasn't going to sit back and let them get away with it. But as they dug deeper, they discovered something they hadn't expected. Someone even closer to Carl than they thought had been working against him all along. The betrayal hit harder than either of them could have imagined, and as the danger grew, so did the strain on their relationship. They had fought so hard to be together, but now, with enemies closing in from all sides, they were facing a new kind of battle, one that could tear them apart for good. In the days that followed the discovery of the betrayal, the atmosphere around Carl and Lovely became strained. Trust had always been hard to come by in Carl's world, but now, even the smallest doubt threatened to unravel everything they had fought for. Carl had locked himself in his office, reviewing every piece of information he had, trying to find the leak in his organization. His temper was short, his focus sharp, and Lovely could feel him slipping away. He was retreating into the hardened man he used to be, the one who didn't rely on anyone but himself. Lovely stood at the doorway, watching him as he pored over documents and made frantic phone calls. She hated seeing him like this, consumed by anger and paranoia, and she hated even more that she couldn't do anything to help. Finally, she stepped into the room, crossing the distance between them and placing a hand on his shoulder. "Carl," she said softly, "you need to take a break." Carl didn't even look up from the papers in front of him. "I can't. Not until I figure out who did this." "You've been at it for days," Lovely insisted. "You need to rest." Carl slammed his fist on the desk, causing the papers to scatter. "I don't have time to rest, Lovely. Don't you understand? Someone inside my circle sold me out. If I don't find out who it is, they'll come after me again, and next time they might come after you too." Lovely flinched at the outburst, but she didn't back down. She knew Carl was terrified of losing control, of losing everything he had built. But she also knew that if he kept pushing himself like this, he would fall apart. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "I'm right here with you. But you can't do this alone." Carl finally looked up at her, his expression weary. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and the toll of the betrayal was written all over his face. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore," he admitted, his voice low. Lovely knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. "You trust me, don't you?" Carl's eyes softened as he looked at her, and for a moment, the cold, calculating mask he had been wearing cracked. He squeezed her hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the only one I trust." Lovely leaned in, resting her forehead against his. "Then let me help you." Carl closed his eyes, letting out a shaky breath. He didn't have to say anything for Lovely to know that he needed her now more than ever. The pieces of the puzzle finally began to fall into place. After days of digging, Carl and Lovely discovered that the betrayal wasn't just coming from some low-level operative in Carl's organization. It was someone far closer, someone they never expected. Jackson, Carl's right-hand man and closest friend. It was a revelation that hit Carl like a freight train. Jackson had been with him since the beginning, through every battle, every victory, every loss. The betrayal felt like a knife in Carl's back, and it cut deeper than anything he had ever faced. When Carl confronted Jackson, the look of guilt on his former friend's face was all the confirmation he needed. Jackson didn't even try to deny it. "I didn't want it to be like this, Carl," Jackson said, his voice heavy with regret, "but you've been reckless. You're putting everyone at risk, including yourself." Carl's hands clenched into fists, his entire body trembling with barely contained rage. "Reckless? You sold me out, Jackson. You put a target on my back." "I had no choice," Jackson shot back. "They would have killed me if I didn't give them something. I had to protect myself." Carl's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with fury. "You were supposed to protect me. You were supposed to have my back." Jackson's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, the two men just stood there, the weight of their broken bond hanging heavy in the air. "I'm sorry, Carl," Jackson said quietly. "I never wanted it to go this far." Carl shook his head, his voice cold. "It's too late for apologies." Lovely, who had been watching the confrontation from a distance, stepped forward. She could see the pain in Carl's eyes, and she knew this betrayal had wounded him in ways that no physical fight ever could. But there was no going back now. Jackson had made his choice, and Carl couldn't afford to show mercy. Carl turned to her, his expression hardened. "Take him to the warehouse," he ordered one of his men, his voice flat and emotionless. As Jackson was dragged away, Lovely moved to Carl's side, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Are you okay?" Carl didn't answer for a long time. He stared after Jackson, his jaw tight, his fists still clenched. Finally, he let out a long, shaky breath. "I will be." The aftermath of Jackson's betrayal left Carl and Lovely reeling. Trust had always been a fragile thing between them, but now it felt almost impossible. Carl had lost one of his closest allies, and the weight of that loss hung heavy over him. But even as the darkness closed in, Lovely stood by Carl's side, refusing to let him push her away. She knew that the only way they could survive this was together, and she wasn't about to give up on him. Not now, not ever. One evening, as they sat together in the penthouse, Carl finally opened up about the pain that had been eating away at him. "I don't know how to keep going, Lovely," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, but now, it feels like it's crumbling around me." Lovely took his hand, her eyes filled with determination. "You're not alone in this, Carl. We'll rebuild. We'll make it stronger." Carl looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. He had never thought he would find someone like Lovely, someone who understood him, who stood by him even when things were falling apart. She was his anchor, the one person who made him believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth fighting for. But the challenges weren't over. As Carl and Lovely worked to pick up the pieces, Carl's enemies made their final move. A rival gang, emboldened by Jackson's betrayal, launched an all-out attack on Carl's operations. They wanted to take everything from him: his business, his power, and his life. The attack was brutal. Carl's men were outnumbered, and the enemy showed no mercy. Lovely found herself in the thick of the fight, her heart racing as gunfire echoed through the streets. She had always been a fighter, but this was different. This was war. Carl fought beside her, his every move calculated, his focus unwavering. But even as they battled their way through the chaos, Lovely could see the toll it was taking on him. He was tired of fighting, tired of losing people he cared about. Just when it seemed like the enemy was going to win, reinforcements arrived. Carl's remaining allies, those who had stayed loyal to him, swooped in, turning the tide of the battle. Together, they pushed back the enemy, forcing them to retreat. By the time the dust settled, Carl and Lovely were exhausted, battered, but alive. They had won the battle, but the cost had been high. As they stood together in the aftermath, surrounded by the ruins of the life Carl had built, Lovely looked up at him, her heart heavy with emotion. "What happens now?" Carl pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "We rebuild," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We rebuild, and we never look back." Lovely rested her head against his chest, her heart filled with both relief and hope. They had faced the fire together, and they had come out the other side stronger than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, because in the end, love was the only thing that could truly withstand the flames. Carl and Lovely had been tested by fire, by betrayal, and by the dangers of the world they lived in. But through it all, their love had endured. It had been forged in the crucible of chaos, and it had emerged unbreakable. As they looked out over the city, the sun rising on a new day, they knew that their journey was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But as long as they had each other, they knew they could overcome anything. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.